390Hz, that's what the Acer Nitro XV252QF runs at. Indeed, this Full HD IPS monitor can run up to 390Hz, and that is its factory overclock from 360Hz. Now in this review, we'll be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK this monitor can be found between £420 and £500, while in the US it can be firmly found for $500, which is quite a steep asking price for a Full HD monitor. Now to kick things off, we have to of course talk about its refresh rate. Now here at 390Hz, I was jumping from my regular 1440p 144Hz monitor, and of course I did notice a bit more fluidity, but other than that there was very little differences. Even from someone who's played over 2,000 hours of competitive Counter-Strike and has reviewed over 190 monitors, I still found the differences between 144Hz and 240Hz, let alone 390Hz, very small. But of course they are there, and if you're going to be someone who's going to be playing high level of Counter-Strike or esports games, then of course you might want to consider a monitor with the highest refresh rate possible. Now the other question is, can you actually output 390Hz? Now I tried for every single thing that I could in order to reduce the resolution, reduce all the graphic quality on a potato gaming looking game like Counter-Strike, and yet I still struggled to output 390Hz on my RTX 2080 Super, which is quite a beastly graphics card. Now granted, there'll be people out there who have got a lot of money, of course, because you're potentially looking at this monitor in the first place, but because you have either a dual GPU configuration or a really beastly GPU in the first place, and therefore you might actually be outputting near 400 FPS. But I think most people coming to this monitor won't be actually outputting that much FPS, and at a certain point you might have to consider, is there any point of you getting 390Hz? Now I can't answer that question for you, but what I can do is give you my subjective opinion and also a bit of objectivity in terms of how this gaming monitor actually performs in terms of its response time and input lag, which is of course one of the core fundamentals of a gaming monitor, apart from of course the refresh rate and its resolution. Now in terms of its response time setting, I was left seriously impressed. Now there are 3 overdrive settings to choose from: off, normal and extreme, and here in the latter mode I noticed very little inverse ghosting or purple trailing around enemies, and as such I was able to hit all my shots and indeed pan around in graphically intense games such as Destiny 2 or indeed esports titles such as CSGO without having to miss an enemy. Quite frankly, I was just really impressed, given the fact that this not only runs an IPS panel, but also because the fact that there's, well, very little inverse ghosting. Now, elsewhere, the other important factor is input lag. Now here, the monitor's input lag was similarly extremely low. I had no problems whatsoever registering my clicks, playing competitive Counter-Strike, or indeed going on deathmatch and trying to shoot enemies. There was no delay that I could notice, and of course we're talking about an IPS panel here, but even in the grand scheme of things, for an esports titled monitor, I can definitely see myself playing at the top level of Counter-Strike and not having any problems whatsoever or doubts that this monitor will help me hit my shots and indeed not make me feel that I'm missing out on, let's say, lower response time or input lag. Now elsewhere you do also have VRB mode. Now this mode is for you to reduce the motion blur, and there are 2 modes to choose from: normal and extreme. In extreme mode here, the brightness will be locked a little bit lower, and we'll talk about the brightness levels just further down in this review, but you should just be bearing in mind here that VRB cannot be used simultaneously with AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now this perfectly leads me onto those 2 technologies. Now just bear in mind that this is an AMD FreeSync monitor, and in my case with my RTX 2080 Super connected over DisplayPort, I had no problems running NVIDIA G-Sync, and yes, I was able to run 390Hz at Full HD with HDR enabled, well, using NVIDIA G-Sync for playing a game such as Destiny 2. Naturally, this brings me on to HDR performance. Now this monitor has HDR 400 certification, and indeed it will reach around 400 nits, be it in HDR or SDR, which is actually pretty impressive. Now here, in terms of its HDR performance, it is, well, a little bit lackluster. It's the same that could be said with any monitor that has up to HDR 400 certification. If you really want a bettered HDR performance, then you'll be wanting to look for an HDR 600 and above monitor. Nevertheless, this monitor is perfectly fine in accepting an HDR signal, and the image does pop in terms of the overall quality, in terms of the colors and even the contrast that you're getting via its HDR signal. Now, I can't suspect many will be actually using HDR or buying this monitor for its HDR capabilities, but it's nice to see that HDR has been actually integrated and potentially might be a certain selling point for console gamers. Although again, I don't quite understand, if you were getting this monitor, you would only get it if you had a console as a secondary device while your primary device was a PC, because consoles cannot run for anything above 120 Hz. Now, moving swiftly on, we get onto image quality. Now, the monitor has an IPS panel, it runs on a 24-inch form factor, and it's got a full HD resolution. Now here, put across my Datacolor SpiderX Elite on DisplayCal, I noticed an sRGB gamut coverage of 93.1% and 93.7% on the sRGB gamut volume. You can see here how it looks like in comparison to the sRGB standard, and in terms of color accuracy, it hits a staggering 1.15 average delta E and a maximum of 2.58 with a contrast ratio of 1019:1. Now this, bearing in mind, is in its sRGB mode, which you can select through the OSD, but if you do not want to run on sRGB mode for certain reasons, I'm not really sure what they might be, but it might be potentially for you to customize the color to your own liking, then you can run on the warm mode or the standard mode. Now in the warm mode, the sRGB color accuracy does decrease to 94.8% in terms of coverage, and the volume goes to 111%. You can see here it's far weird in terms of its sRGB color accuracy, and specifically in terms of its average delta E, it goes up to 2.65 and a maximum of 7.76 with a contrast ratio of 915:1, which I actually find a little bit surprising that its contrast ratio dropped slightly in comparison to sRGB mode. Now the only thing to be mindful about is sRGB mode does limit in terms of overall brightness, but it's actually perfectly acceptable. And before I jump into that, I do have to quickly mention that there's a max brightness mode in the OSD, and I'll showcase this very shortly. Now this allows you to have a somewhat uncapped brightness, and according to Adam from PC Monitors, it's a way of having a less eco-friendly monitor. In all honesty, I don't really see why the option has been enabled over here or has been there. I think it's mainly for certificates or for Acer to check a box, but regardless, I think most consumers will want to enable max brightness mode on, and then for you to tailor the brightness to your actual desired level. Now in terms of its peak brightness, in terms of with max brightness enabled, you get up to 430 nits, therefore achieving the HDR 400 certification. If you were to disable max brightness, this will go down to 215 nits, which is far dimmer. Now as for minimum brightness, it gets down to around 99 nits, and as for the max brightness in sRGB mode, you can see it's 382 nits, so therefore down from 430 nits, but it's still perfectly bright. Now while its brightness is very impressive across the board, what isn't so great is the overall uniformity. Now here, the brightness, as you'll see on your screen, is pretty shocking, and I know it is very much panel lottery, but it's very rare to see quite a lot of orange, or shall I say yellow, boxes that appear on screen. And indeed, in terms of backlight bleed, there was quite significant backlight bleed on my monitor. Now, is it noticeable if you're gaming in a very dark scenario? Potentially. If you're playing a lot of dark games, there might be again a little bit of an issue, but if you're playing in normal daylight time or even in nighttime with some lights on, or indeed if you're playing, let's say, a game like Counter-Strike where it's not completely pitch black, then I think you'll find that the IPS bleed and indeed the uniformity is perfectly acceptable. The only reason I'm pointing this out is because there are certain gamers out there that will really find that the IPS bleed is just not really for them, and or they use or play on very dark games or in very dark scenarios, and as such, for those type of gamers, IPS panels are generally not sought after, and in this case you might want to look at a VA or a TN panel instead. Now moving on to the monitor's OSD, can be accessed through a little joystick button found behind the monitor. It's very easy to access, and through here you'll find a plethora of different options. Now I do want to mention the HDR setting. You've got a few different modes to choose from, and you will probably want to run it on auto on most modes if you're going to run HDR content. If however you don't use HDR content like myself, you might want to leave it disabled, because then you'll have a few different options at your disposal. Now super sharpness does get enabled by default for some reason on HDR, but I would disable that if I were you. As for max brightness, I did touch upon this before. It just seems a little bit silly to have the notification over here, but regardless, you'll probably want to enable that, and then for you to tail around with the brightness level yourself manually. Now as for the color settings, you have got a few different ones to choose from, but if you want the most color accurate one, you'll probably want to go on the color space and then go on the sRGB mode. This will, however, lock you in terms of allowing you to change certain settings, but thankfully it doesn't lock the brightness level. You can still adjust that, and you can still have it running with HDR, and also you can run sRGB mode with the rest of the gaming settings as well. So that's completely up to you as to how you want to run it. Now, as for the audio, it's got built-in speakers. They're not exactly that great. I would very much urge you to run a set of bookshelf speakers, or at the very least, if you're running a gaming and hardcore gamer, then get yourself a set of headphones or a DAC or something like that. Now, as for gaming, I will strongly suggest you to run on extreme mode pretty much all the time. There's very little inverse ghosting, as I mentioned before. Now, as for AMD FreeSync, I don't personally use it, nor do I use NVIDIA G-Sync generally, but of course the option is there for you to use. Just as a little note, it can't be used simultaneously with VRB. Now, VRB, I did mention, does lock the overall brightness, so you've got the two different modes, normal and extreme, to choose from, so just bear that in mind. As for aim point, it's a virtual aim point that shows up on your screen. OSD is pretty self-explanatory, and as for the system settings, the two that you'll be most interested about is the hotkey assignments. I do quite like the fact that you can quickly access two settings, so such as overdrive and brightness, and then elsewhere you've got the overclock segment, where you'll probably want to have that enabled because it's a 390 Hz display, but natively runs on 360 Hz, and therefore if you disable this, the maximum refresh rate will be down to 360 Hz. Now finally we get onto the design and build quality, and here the monitor has a three-side borderless design. There's a small little bezel at the bottom, and as I did mention, the OSD buttons can be accessed from the back of the monitor. Now, as for the stand, while it is a little bit flimsy and it looks a little bit cheap, in my opinion it does all what it requires. It's got full height, tilt, pivot, and even rotating adjustments, and it's not too obnoxious in terms of the color scheme that it uses. There's no fancy or silly RGB lights either, so that's a definite plus point in my books. So this brings us on to my verdict. Would I recommend the Acer Nitro monitor? I guess the question is, can you run 390 Hz at full HD, or even if you were to ramp down your graphics, can you consistently hit 390 Hz? That's for you to answer the question, and I suspect the answer will be no for a lot of consumers out there. Now, if you do want the highest performance Full HD monitor out there on the market and you have an infinite budget, then arguably this is the best monitor on the market. Now, as a result, it actually gets my performance award. Why doesn't it not get my Best Buy award? Well, frankly, because there are other monitors to consider. 1440p at 240Hz, for example, or Full HD at 240Hz. The latter can be found at half the asking price of this Acer Nitro monitor, and that's not even considering if you want 240Hz in the first place, and thus could even get a Full HD 144 or a 1440p 144Hz monitor instead. Now, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below as to if you would buy this monitor if you had the budget, and furthermore, would you pick some of its alternatives instead? Now, if you've liked this independent, detailed review, definitely do drop a like as it's greatly appreciated, and do consider subscribing if you haven't already and hitting that bell notification. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.